Okay, another Saturday, back to another devotion. This time, Matthew 20. In our continuing fulfillment theme, Matthew 20, we're going with the fulfillment of a wage this time. A wage. Now in this chapter, we will discuss the fulfillment of a wage. The fulfillment of an indeterminate wage promised to the workers. Workers that may be fairly assumed to be followers of Jesus. Granted, this is just a parable, so it is not a real fulfillment and should not be dissected like a frog. As a result, there is minimal commentary on this parable by our commentators. However, that real fulfillment is soon to follow for those followers of Jesus, for the disciple James at any rate, and for the follower Stephen. Soon to follow for those that follow to the very end, when those kingdom of heaven wages will be paid to a large extent. Yes, payable on death, as the band POD suggests. But those wages should be seen as a ransom rather than actual wages. A ransom that we will get into at the end of this study. But first, let's address that blind man difficulty. The difficulty that we find at the end of this chapter. The difficulty that we find somewhere around Jericho, the lowest city in the world. A city that was soon after captured by Rome and only reoccupied by Israel in 1967, following a near miraculous 6-day war. A war named after the 6 days of creation, of course. Now, in order to harmonize the accounts of our Gospels on this blind man of Matthew 20 and Mark 10, we need to have Jesus heal a blind man before entering that city, as well as heal 2 blind men after exiting that city. Perfectly doable events for Jesus. I don't see a problem there at all. Matthew doesn't have to relate both events, or even one event at this point. After all, Matthew even related the healing of 2 blind men previously, so it's not as if that optical miracle was exhausted or anything like that. Nope, Jesus was on a tear now, and Jesus really didn't care if they told their friends or family now. The stage was perfectly set for Isaiah 53 to be fulfilled. Yeah, Passover was just a few days away. Now, it's possible that Matthew may have been on a bathroom break at the time of the first healing, or it's possible that Matthew was checking out the old Jericho ruins. Yeah, foundational history for sure. So Mark may have gotten that blind man account from some other source altogether, from some other disciple, or from one of the large crowd now following, as we read in verse 29. Perhaps even from the blind man himself. After all, Mark and blind Bartimaeus seem to be on a first-name basis now. And that's perfectly fine. No real difficulty and no real dilemma here. No harmony of the Gospels is actually required here. Nope, singing solo is perfectly legitimate. There is also the remote rationale that the traditionalist Matthew was referring to exiting the remains of the old Jericho, about a mile north. You know, the one where the walls fell down. Whereas young Mark was referring to the entering of the new Jericho, a direction that they would travel after crossing the Jordan River, a direction they would travel on their way to Jerusalem. But along with France, I think that explanation is pretty weak. When in doubt, go with the bigger and better Jericho for both. Go with the one that could be the more charitable towards blind men. Go with the Jericho that was richly developed by Herod the Great. You remember him? Herod the Great. Yeah. the Jericho that had the hippodrome, palaces, and a swimming pool, a far more recognizable and habitable Jericho that Herod enjoyed. Herod the Great, Herod the First. Remember him? The one that killed all these children in Bethlehem? Remember that? Herod the Great. The guy whose this coin is dedicated to. Yeah. Wow, wow, eh? Wow, wow. Maybe we'll get you a better picture of that later. We'll send you something a little bit later, I think. Oh, a little reading about this. This coin, this bronze pruta, were minted in Herod's name. They were all crudely minted in small quantities. The images are of a double cornucopia and a central caduceus on one side and an anchor on the other. Well, well, isn't that something? His designs all avoided images of animate objects, thus obeying the second commandment, forbidding graven images. Well, Herod the Great made a great Jericho too. But back to our chapter. First off, in this chapter, we see a parable about a vineyard, but mostly a parable about the vineyard owner. A parable that is not all that popular with teetotalers, not popular with those that are totally opposed to booze and don't see the point of the parable. And it is not as if you can prevent those grapes in the vineyard from turning into booze either. Not even if you make this juice from dried grapes. Unless you make this new wine from dried grapes immediately before the Passover, since the grape harvest is still a good few months away. But as we will be seeing in Matthew chapter 26, that would be totally contrary to Isaiah chapter 25, where wine for the Passover was supposed to be fairly well aged, just as the covenant of faith was fairly well aged. As Isaiah said, refined, aged wine. Yeah, just as the faith of Abraham was quite refined and aged, you might say. However, the natural yeast in the grapes would only turn that wine to the strength of a standard beer at best. And the Jews wouldn't drink all that much of that symbolic wine either, spacing out the drinking over the course of the Seder festival and even watering it down at times. Drinking a minimal amount on special occasions, like the upcoming Passover, with the red wine representing the blood aspect of the Passover, perhaps. With Jesus drinking even less of that alcoholic wine, according to Tyndale historian Instone Brewer, who we referred to earlier. But that's getting a little ahead of ourselves. Also, as I have mentioned repeatedly, first and foremost, the parables of Jesus were primarily about one thing. Yes, one thing. They had one standout punchline, as in Jeremiah would also say. And that punchline is repent. In this particular case, repent of accusing the vineyard owner of gross injustice. A parable not unlike the brother of the prodigal son accusing his father of gross injustice, as if we had a far better grasp of heavenly justice. Yet as Paul sums up the justice of God in Romans 9, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. If justice were the rule, rather than the exception, there would be no mercy or compassion whatsoever. We would all barely survive childbirth. Now, the wages paid out to those workers were the wages of a common man. The uncommon man would be paid twice as much, of course. They would be more inclined to get 2 denarius a day. But these were just common day laborers, with a Roman denarius being the cheaper version of the Greek drachma. This, what I just showed you, was just a pruta, not a drachma. Greek drachma, or Jewish shekel that was minted in Tyre. Tyre, yes, remember Tyre and Sidon? Minted in Tyre. Rome shortchanged the silver in that puppy, however. Shortchanged the silver in that denarius from 92.5% down to 80% silver. Just like Canada started shortchanging the silver of our ultra-thin dimes after the war, after the big one, World War I, before eliminating the silver altogether in our 1967 coins. As a result, you couldn't use that cheaper version of the denarius to pay the temple tax. That would be robbing the temple, and you wouldn't want to do that now, would you? However, that concept of a denarius might give you some sense of the universality of those wages. That those wages are not exclusively for Jews, you see. That those wages are for Romans and Greeks too. Wonderful news for some, like Luke, for instance. Yet not great news for those that thought they were shortchanged by the vineyard owner. They began to grumble. They began to, there's a Greek word, egongerson. Egongerson. As Rob Plummer of the Daily Dose of Greek says, a word that sounds an awful lot like grumbling. Egongerson. With no real reason for that grumbling, however. Just like we have no real reason for boasting of any heavenly wages that we might get paid. At the risk of sounding too Calvinistic, they are entirely the result of God's grace to us. Nothing more, nothing less, nothing earned. They are nothing that we could possibly earn. It is entirely a case of God granting this grace to us. A grace that the mother of Zebedee's sons was acutely aware of, that the otherwise knowledgeable mother of James and John was requesting for her sons in verse 21. Bizarre, huh? Now, were those precious sons of hers actually capable of drinking from that cup that Jesus was about to drink from? Well, capable, but certainly not able. That is the distinct implication here. Even though Matthew doesn't develop that thought at all. He doesn't develop it because he doesn't have to. No, certainly not able, since they were unworthy sinners. And certainly not able, since they were certainly not the Son of Man. Now mentioned again by Jesus. Again. After mentioning that already a dozen times. And mentioning that immediately beforehand in verse 18. And immediately afterwards in verse 28. Yeah. And immediately mentioning it. A request that would make absolutely no sense if Peter was already given the keys to the kingdom of heaven previously. And thinking that those keys had been revoked in the last verse of our previous chapter, well, that's a pretty big stretch, even for a mother. And this was not so much a ransom that was paid in verse 28 either. Not so much a ransom as it was a substitutionary atonement that was made, which is what this unique Greek word, there's the unique Greek word there, lutronanti, lutronanti actually suggests. It actually suggests substitutionary atonement, according to France. A perpetual substitution in order that this kidnapping could not possibly happen again, not in life and not in death, not by powers nor principalities. There's a graphic of that substitution. And for that we have God to thank.